I moved into my house on a Saturday in late August, and my neighbor helped me carry boxes without being asked. That is the part one always come back to. Not what came later. Not the things I found out, not the nights I couldn't sleep, not the way it ended. I come back to that Saturday afternoon when a man I had never met walked across the lawn with his sleeves rolled up and said, "Looks like you could use a hand." And I said yes because I could, because I was 30 years old and moving into my first house alone, and I was exhausted and grateful and completely unprepared for what I had just moved next to. His name was Robert Calloway. He was 53 years old. He had lived in the house next to mine for 11 years. He had gray at his temples and a quiet smile and the kind of steady, unhurried way of moving through the world that makes you feel instinctively that a person is trustworthy. Like someone who has nothing to hide, because hiding things would require a kind of energy he simply doesn't spend. I believed that about him for 14 months. I want to tell you everything. All of it from the beginning. Not because I have processed it fully, I am not sure I ever will. But because telling it is the only way I know to make it feel like something that happened to me rather than something that is still happening. And because somewhere in the people watching this, there might be someone who recognizes something. Some small detail that lands differently after hearing this story. Something they have been noticing and not quite letting themselves name. If that is you, I need you to stay until the end. My name is Mara. I am 32 now. When I moved into the house on Clement Street, I was 30. Newly out of a 4-year relationship that had ended badly, freshly promoted at my job as a civil engineer for the county, and in the specific emotional state of someone who has decided to outrun grief through forward motion. Buy the house. Start the chapter. Build the life. Don't stop moving or you will have to feel the things you have been outrunning. I did not stop moving for about 6 months. And in those 6 months, Robert Calloway became something I did not have a good word for. Not a friend exactly. There was too much distance in his manner for that. A careful pleasantness that kept you at arm's length even while being entirely warm. Not just a neighbor, because we talked more than neighbors typically do. Something in between. A presence. A reliable, steady, available presence that I came to depend on in the way you come to depend on things when you are living alone for the first time and the house makes sounds at night that you don't yet know how to interpret. He would wave from his driveway. He would leave vegetables from his garden on my porch step. Zucchini and tomatoes, and once a truly enormous bundle of basil that I didn't know what to do with and ended up making into pesto I ate for 2 weeks. He would notice when something needed doing, when my gutter was blocked, when my porch light went out, and mention it without offering to fix it himself, which I appreciated. He was helpful without being intrusive. Present without being overwhelming. He had a wife named Carol. I saw her less than I saw him. She was quieter, smaller in the way some people are smaller. Not in physical size but in presence, like a person who has learned to take up less space than they are owed. She smiled when we passed in the driveway. She accepted the pesto recipe I printed out and left in their mailbox with a note that I hoped was friendly and not strange. She never initiated conversation, but she responded warmly when I did. Thought she was shy. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. They had no children that I could see. No evidence of children. No toys in the yard, no drawings in windows, no small shoes by the door. This was not something I thought about consciously at the time. I noticed it the way you notice ambient details about people you see regularly, filed it under no kids moved on. There was a basement window on the side of their house that faced my driveway. It was always covered. Not with curtains exactly, with something darker, something that blocked light entirely rather than filtering it. I noticed it in my first week on Clement Street because I am an engineer and I notice structural and architectural details the way other people notice clothing or hairstyles. And the window covering seemed slightly unusual. Slightly too deliberate. I filed that away too. This is the part one think about most when I look back. The filing away. The noticing things and consciously deciding not to make anything of them because making something of them would be uncomfortable and inconvenient, and I was not in the business of being uncomfortable and inconvenient in the first weeks of my new life. I was building something. I didn't have room for complications. The first thing that I could not file away happened about 3 months after I moved in. It was a Wednesday night in November. I had come home late from a site visit, which happens regularly in my work. Construction schedules don't observe conventional hours and neither do the engineers who manage them. It was close to 11 when I pulled into my driveway. The street was quiet. Most of the houses had their lights off. Robert's house did not. This was not unusual on its own. People keep different hours. But there was something about the specific configuration of the lights that caught my attention as I got out of my car. The upstairs windows were dark. The living room window was dark. The only light visible was from that basement window, or rather from around the edges of the thing covering it. A thin line of yellow light that outlined the frame of the window like a drawing. Someone was in that basement at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. I stood in my driveway looking at it for a moment. And then I went inside and I told myself that people use their basements at night all the time. Workshops. Home gyms. Hobby rooms. Late-night laundry. There were 100 completely unremarkable explanations for a light in a basement at 11 p.m. and I had no reason to choose the unremarkable ones over anything else. I went to bed. I lay awake for a while. I went to sleep. 3 weeks later I heard the sound. I need to describe it carefully because it is a sound I have never heard before or since and I am not sure I have adequate words for it. It came through the wall that divided my kitchen from the side of Robert's property. Not through any structural gap, just through the proximity of sound to thin walls on a quiet night. It was low. Not music, not the television, not any of the ordinary sounds that travel between houses in a close neighborhood. Lower than those things and less rhythmic. Almost like breathing but not breathing. Almost like a voice but not a voice. Something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck do the specific thing that hair on the back of your neck does when your body knows something before your brain does. It lasted about 40 seconds. And then it stopped. I stood in my kitchen with a glass of water I had come downstairs to get and I stood very still and I waited for it to come again. It didn't. I went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed. I thought about the sound for a long time. And then I did the thing I had been doing since I moved in. I found a reasonable explanation. Old houses near each other, sound traveling strangely through shared geological foundation, pipes, HVAC systems, any number of perfectly mundane acoustic phenomena. I am an engineer. I know how sound behaves in built environments. I know it does strange things. I told myself that. I believed it mostly. The second thing happened in January. I had a day off. A rare full weekday off. Accumulated leave that my supervisor had insisted I take before the end of the fiscal quarter. I spent the morning doing the things you do on unexpected free days. Slow coffee, overdue laundry, the particular luxury of not being anywhere at a specific time. Around 11 I decided to take a walk, which I had not been doing enough of since the move, and I put on my coat and went out. The street was quiet in the specific way that residential streets are quiet on weekday mornings when most people are at work. A dog barking somewhere. A delivery truck at the far end of the block. The winter light that is both bright and cold and seems to clarify everything it touches. I was locking my front door when I heard Robert's front door open. I turned. He was not alone. He was with a woman I had never seen before. She was young, mid-20s I guess, though she carried herself in the slightly collapsed way of someone who is younger than their body looks, if that makes sense. Thin in a way that raced something in me before I could name what it was. She was wearing a coat that seemed too light for January. She had a bag on her shoulder. Not a large bag, not a suitcase, just a regular bag, the kind you'd carry to work or to run errands. Robert had his hand on her elbow. Not roughly. I want to be precise about that because it matters for what I understood in that moment and what I understand now. He was not dragging her. His hand was on her elbow and he was walking beside her, and from any angle you looked at it, it was just two people walking together. But she was not looking at him. She was looking at the street. At the air in front of her. With the specific unfocused gaze of someone who has removed themselves mentally from the situation they are physically inside. I recognized that gaze. I had worn it myself in a different context in the bad years of my relationship when the only way to get through certain evenings was to not quite be there. Robert saw me. He smiled. "Morning, Mara." "Day off." "Day off," I said. I smiled back. "Hi," I said to the woman. She looked at me. And something happened in her eyes. Just for a second. Something that was there and then not there, like a candle that flickers when a door opens. "This is my niece," Robert said. "She's staying with us for a bit." "Nice to meet you," I said. The niece said nothing. Robert guided her toward his car. She got in. He went around to the driver's side. He looked at me once more before he got in. Just a look, nothing in it that I could point to as wrong, just a look, and then he drove away. I stood on my front porch and I watched the car go. And I did not file it away this time. I stood there and I let myself feel what I had been feeling for 4 months without permission. The basement light. The sound in the kitchen. The covered window. The way Carol moved through space like someone conserving themselves. And now a young woman with a January coat that wasn't warm enough, a bag she held like she was ready to need it, and eyes that had flickered when they met mine. I went back inside. I sat down at my kitchen table. And I asked myself for the first time clearly and directly, what I actually thought was happening next door. I want to be honest with you about what I thought. Because thinking it was terrifying. Because thinking it meant I could no longer not think it. Because thinking it meant I had to decide what to do with it. And deciding what to do with it was going to require a kind of courage I was not sure I had. I thought something was very wrong in that house. I did not know what. I did not have proof of anything. I had a window covering and a sound and a niece with the wrong coat and a look that lasted less than a second. That is not evidence of anything. That is the ambient noise of living next to strangers, assembled into a pattern by a brain that is looking for patterns. I knew all of that. And I also knew what I had felt standing on that porch watching the car drive away. I called my friend Priya. Priya is the person I call when I need someone to be honest with me. Not comforting, not reassuring, honest. She has known me since we were in graduate school together, and she has a quality I have always valued and occasionally found exhausting, which is that she does not let me talk myself out of things I know to be true. I told her everything. The whole 4 months of small things I had been filing away. And the woman in the January coat. When I finished, Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want me to tell you?" I said, "I want you to tell me I'm imagining it." She said, "I can't tell you that. Priya. I can't tell you that because I don't know if it's true. And neither do you. That's the problem." She paused. "What would make you feel like you had to do something?" I thought about that. "If I heard the sound again," I said. "Okay," she said. "Then pay attention." I paid attention. What I am about to tell you covers the next 6 weeks, and I want to be careful about how I tell it because some of it I saw directly and some of it I put together afterward, and I don't want to blur those two things into each other. What I saw directly was this. The niece, I did not learn her name for a long time, left with Robert 3 more times in January. Each time same coat. Each time same bag. Each time she returned with him, usually in the early evening, and each time she went directly inside without looking at me even when I was visible in my own yard or driveway. Carol was outside twice in January. Once to check the mail, once to put something in the recycling bin. Both times she glanced toward my house. The second time, when our eyes met, she looked away so quickly that it felt less like shyness and more like a decision. The basement light was on 3 more times that I saw, always late, always the same thin yellow outline around the covered window. And on the last Thursday of January I heard the sound again. I was in my kitchen again, this time not by accident. I want to be honest about that. I had started spending time in my kitchen at night at the wall that faced their property, listening. Not every night. I was not so far gone that I was doing it every night. But enough nights. Enough times. I heard it at 12 minutes past 10. The same quality as before. Low, sustained, that impossible in-between register that was almost breath and almost voice, and neither of those things exactly. It lasted longer this time. Almost 2 minutes. And then, underneath it or within it or separate from it, I am still not certain of the spatial relationship, I heard something else. A word. One word, muffled by walls and distance and whatever was between my kitchen and its source, but a word. A recognizable human word. The word was please. I stood at that wall with my hand flat against it, and I felt my heart do something I have no clinical word for. Not racing exactly. More like a single, hard, total contraction. Like my body was trying to make itself very small. I called Priya. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I need you to help me figure out what to do." She said, "Tell me." I told her about the word. She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 15 seconds. Then she said, "You need to call someone." Not me. Someone with actual authority. I said, "I don't have anything concrete." One word through a wall. "They'll think I'm Mara." Her voice was quiet and very clear. "You are an engineer. You have been noticing specific, concrete, observable things for 4 months. Write them down. Write all of them down with dates where you have them. And then call the non-emergency police line and tell them you have concerns about your neighbor and you would like to speak to someone." I wrote them down. Took me 2 hours. Not because there was so much, there wasn't really in terms of sheer volume. But because putting it in order, in writing, in the specific language of documented observation rather than feeling, made it real in a way that it had not quite been real before. I could see it when it was written. The pattern that my brain had been assembling for months was visible on paper. The covered window. The specific quality of the basement light. The sound on 2 separate occasions, the second time containing a word. A young woman with a too light coat who arrived with a bag and never initiated contact and whose eyes had done that flickering thing. Carol's avoidance. Robert's single look before he got into the car. I read it back to myself. And then I called. The officer I spoke to was a woman named Sergeant Delgado. I want to tell you about her specifically because she is one of the reasons this story ends the way it does. She listened to me completely. She did not interrupt. She did not make me feel foolish. When I finished, she asked 3 clarifying questions. About the specific location of the basement window relative to the street. About the occasions when I had seen the young woman. About the dates as best I could recall them. Then she said, I want to be clear with you about something. What you are describing is concerning enough that I would like to send someone to do a welfare check. That is within our authority and it requires no further evidence than what you've given me. Do you consent to being identified as the person who called, if that becomes necessary? I said yes. I said yes even though it frightened me to say yes. Because what Priya had said was right. Because that word through the wall was not something I could set aside any longer. 2 officers went to Robert's door the following afternoon. I know this because I was home having taken half a day of leave with an excuse I invented, and I watched from my front window with the specific horrible stillness of someone who has set something in motion and cannot take it back. Robert answered the door. I watched him speak to the officers. I could not hear anything. From my window at this distance he looked exactly as he always looked. Calm, pleasant, the steady, unhurried quality that had made me trust him. He gestured once toward the interior of the house and then appeared to say something that made the officers exchange a glance. Carol appeared at the door behind him. She also spoke to the officers. After about 10 minutes, one of the officers stepped inside. The other remained at the door with Robert and Carol. The officer was inside for 7 minutes. I timed it. When he came back out, he spoke briefly to his partner. Then both officers spoke to Robert for a few more minutes. Then they left. I watched Robert watch their car leave. And then he turned and looked directly at my window. I stepped back from the glass. My heart was doing that thing again. I did not sleep that night. Sergeant Delgado called me the next morning. She said the welfare check had not produced anything that warranted further action at that time. The young woman was present, identified herself, stated she was a family member staying temporarily, and indicated she was there voluntarily. There was no visible evidence of distress or restraint. The interior of the home in the areas the officer observed was normal. I said, "Did she seem okay to you?" To the officer. Pause. The officer noted that she appeared somewhat withdrawn. But withdrawn is not a crime and she did not indicate any problem. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Withdrawn is not a crime. I understood that. I am a reasonable person. I understand the limits of what constitutes actionable concern versus discomfort and intuition. I understood that what I had could not compel further intervention. But I also understood something else. Robert had looked directly at my window as the officers drove away. He knew. And knowing that he knew changed something in my situation that I had not fully calculated when I made the call. I was now a person who had called the police on my neighbor. My neighbor who knew I had called. My neighbor who, I was increasingly certain, had something in his house that he needed to keep hidden and who was now aware that the person living 12 feet away had noticed enough to act on it. I called Priya that night. I told her what Delgado had said. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Wait, so they can't do anything right now. That doesn't mean nothing is happening." "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" I thought about that for a long time. "I'm going to keep paying attention," I said. "And I'm going to be more careful about how I do it." What I mean by more careful is this. I stopped spending time at the kitchen wall. I stopped visible observation from my front window. I behaved in every external way as though the welfare check had satisfied me and life had returned to normal. I waved at Robert when I saw him. I accepted the tomatoes he left on my porch in the following weeks with the same gratitude I always had. And I documented everything. Every light in the basement window. Every sighting of the young woman. Every time Carol's behavior shifted from its baseline. I did this quietly and systematically in a notebook that I kept in my car rather than my house, in case something happened to my house. I also did something else. I started talking to my other neighbors. Not about Robert. Not directly. I introduced myself. It had been almost 6 months and I had not done the basic neighborly thing of meeting the people on my street beyond the Callaways. And I asked questions that were general enough to seem like small talk and specific enough to give me what I was looking for. How long have you lived here? Do you know the Callaways well? Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Most people answered with pleasant variations of not long, somewhat, not really. One person did not. Her name was Eunice. She was 71 years old and had lived on Clement Street for 22 years, and she had the quality that some older people have of saying exactly what they think without organizing it first into something socially convenient. She said when I asked if she knew the Callaways, I used to. Less so now. Something changed over there about 2 years ago. Robert used to be more outgoing. Now he keeps to himself. And Carol, she stopped. She looked at me with the specific evaluating look of someone deciding whether to continue. Carol, I said. Carol used to garden, Eunice said. Had the most beautiful garden on the street. About 2 years ago she stopped. The beds just went to nothing. I asked her about it once and she said she'd gotten busy. But she didn't look busy. She looked. Another pause. She looked like she was being careful. I said, careful about what? Eunice looked at me for a long moment. I don't know, she said. That's just the word that came to mind. I went home. I sat in my car in my own driveway and I sat with what Eunice had said and with everything else I had been carrying for 6 months, and I did something I had not done since the first week of all this. I let myself be afraid. Not the managed, filed away, reasonable explanation kind of not afraid. Actually afraid. The kind that sits in your stomach and does not respond to logic. Something was wrong in that house. I did not know what. But I knew, with the specific certainty of a person who processes information for a living and had been processing this information for 6 months, that the thing I was afraid of was not a product of loneliness or overactive imagination or the particular anxiety of a woman living alone for the first time. It was a response to something real. The next thing happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I was backing out of my driveway when I saw Carol in her front yard. This was the first time I had seen her in the yard in weeks. She was standing near the mailbox, not doing anything, not collecting mail, not going anywhere, just standing. And she was looking at my car. I rolled down my window. Carol, I said. Hi. She looked at me. In the evening light her face was difficult to read. She looked tired in the deep way, the kind of tired that is not about sleep. Hi Mara, she said. Something in her voice. I put the car in park. Are you okay? I asked. She looked toward the house. A quick look, involuntary, and then back to me. I'm fine, she said. Just getting some air. There was a pause that neither of us filled. Then she said very quietly, not quite looking at me, how are you finding the street? Do you like it here? It was an ordinary question. It was not delivered like an ordinary question. I said, I do. I feel pretty settled now. It took a few months. She nodded. She said still quietly, it's good to feel settled. And then she went back inside. I sat in my driveway for 5 minutes. And then I drove to Priya's apartment. I told her about Carol in the yard. I told her about the thing in Carol's voice. I told her about Eunice's word, careful. Priya listened to all of it. Then she said, I think you need to talk to Delgado again. I said, I have the same amount of nothing I had in January. You have more than you had in January, Priya said. You have a pattern. You have a neighbor who gardened for 20 years and stopped. You have Carol in her yard looking at your car like she wanted to tell you something. You have a young woman who has been there since January and who the officer described as withdrawn. She looked at me steadily. What is the threshold? What do you need to see before you are willing to say this is enough? I thought about that. I thought about what enough would look like. What the line was between being a responsible, concerned neighbor and being someone who was inserting herself into something that wasn't hers. What the cost was of being wrong. And then I thought about the cost of being right and not doing anything. I called Delgado the next morning. He remembered me. She listened to the update. I gave her everything. The additional basement observations, Eunice's account of the garden and Carol's demeanor, the conversation in the driveway. She was quiet for a longer time than she had been the first time. Then she said, I want to be transparent with you. What you're describing doesn't meet the threshold for a warrant. But there is someone I would like to connect you with, a detective who works on certain kinds of cases who I think would benefit from hearing what you've observed. Would you be willing to speak with him? I said yes. His name was Detective Okafor. He called me that afternoon. He asked me to come in the following morning, which I did. I brought my notebook. He was a careful, methodical man who took notes in a way that made me feel like every word I said was being given its full weight. He asked questions I had not anticipated, about the young woman's physical appearance in detail, about whether I had ever seen her arrive or only depart and return, about whether there were ever other visitors to the house, about the specific times of the basement light. He asked if I had ever seen any delivery vehicles stop at the house that seemed unusual. I thought about that. I said there had been a van a couple of times, that I had noticed because it had no markings and I had wondered vaguely what was being delivered. He wrote that down. He said, Ms. Mara, I want to ask you something and I want you to understand that I am not asking because I doubt you or because I think you have done anything wrong. I am asking because I need to understand your level of certainty. In your judgment, based on everything you have observed and your own professional training in detail-oriented observation, do you believe something involuntary is happening in that house? I had not been asked that question so directly before. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, yes. I believe something involuntary is happening in that house. I believe the young woman is not there freely. I believe Carol Calloway knows about it and is not free to tell anyone. And I believe Robert Calloway has been managing this very carefully for a long time. Okafor nodded slowly. He said, give me a week. I gave him a week. The week was the longest of my life. I went to work. I came home. I did not allow myself to observe any more than the unavoidable. I did not want to complicate anything, did not want Robert to notice increased attention on my part. I cooked. I called my mother who does not know any of this story and still does not. I tried to sleep, mostly without success. On the 6th day Priya came over and we sat on my back porch in the cold and she did not ask about Robert or Delgado or Okafor and I was grateful for that. We talked about other things for 3 hours. For 3 hours I was just a person sitting on a porch with her closest friend and not a person waiting for something to break open. On the 7th day Detective Okafor called. He said, I need you to do something for me. I need you to stay inside tonight, keep your lights normal, behave exactly as you would on any other evening. I need you to not look out any windows facing the Calloway property between 9 p.m. and midnight. Can you do that? I said yes. I said, is it? I can't tell you anything more right now, he said. But I need you to trust that I am asking you to do this for a reason. I trusted him. I stayed inside. I kept my lights normal. I watched television I could not concentrate on and I did not look at windows. At 10:47 p.m. I heard cars. Multiple cars. Not the sound of traffic. The sound of cars arriving deliberately, parking, doors opening and closing with a specific kind of quiet efficiency. I stayed on my couch. At 11:12 p.m. there was a knock on my front door. It was Delgado. She had another officer with her. She said, Are you all right? I said, What happened? She said, Robert Calloway has been arrested. Carol Calloway is being interviewed and is cooperating. The young woman you saw is safe. There are others. Others. I sat down on my front step. I said, Others. Delgado sat down beside me. Not something police officers typically do, I imagine. But she sat down beside me on my front step on a cold March night and she said, You did the right thing. I want you to know that. Whatever you're feeling right now, I need you to hold on to the fact that you did the right thing. I said, How many? She said she could not tell me that yet. I did not ask again that night. What I learned over the following weeks came in pieces, some through Okafor, some through the public record as the case developed, some through Priya who followed the coverage more carefully than I could bring myself to. I am going to tell you what I know and I am going to be clear about what I don't know because there are things in this case that have not been made public and there are things I have chosen not to pursue for my own reasons. Robert Calloway had been using his home for a period of at least 3 years to house young women who were not there voluntarily. The specifics of how they arrived and under what circumstances are part of an ongoing legal matter and I am not going to describe them here. What I will tell you is that the young woman I had seen, the one with the January coat and the flickering eyes, was 24 years old and had been in that house for 5 months. There were 2 others found that night in the basement in conditions I am not going to describe because I cannot describe them without my hands shaking. Carol Calloway had known. This is the part that I have spent the most time with, longer even than the part about Robert himself. Carol had known for at least 2 years. She had been complicit in ways that the legal process will determine the precise extent of. She had also, by her own account in cooperation with investigators, been afraid. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I do not know what to do with that, and I have decided that not knowing what to do with it is acceptable. That some things do not resolve into clean understanding, and that is not a failure of intelligence or compassion. Eunice had been right. Carol had been careful. Robert was arraigned on charges that I will not enumerate because they are available in the public record for anyone who wants to find them. He did not look like a man with a quiet smile and steady hands when he was walked out of that house. He looked like what he was. I moved out of the house on Clement Street 4 months later. I want to be honest about why. Not because I felt unsafe. Robert was in custody, there was no threat. Not because of what the neighbors knew or didn't know, though the weeks after the arrest had their own particular difficulty. I moved because every time I pulled into my driveway I saw the side of that house. The window. The thin line of yellow light that I had filed away on a November night as one of 100 reasonable explanations. I could not keep living next to what that window now meant to me. I live in a different neighborhood now. An apartment this time on the 3rd floor, which feels important in ways I do not entirely understand. I have a neighbor above me and a neighbor below me, and I know both of their names. I have never had a reason to worry about either of them, and I have looked clearly enough to be confident in that. I want to tell you what this experience did to me. Not the dramatic parts. The investigation, the arrest, the pieces I had to give to lawyers and social workers in the months that followed. The internal parts. What it did inside. Made me trust myself more. I know that sounds strange given the context. I spent 14 months doubting myself, explaining things away, filing things under reasonable interpretation. But in the end I did not explain it away completely. In the end I made the call. In the end, when Okafor asked me directly whether I believed something involuntary was happening in that house, I said yes. Curry. Without qualifying it into something smaller. That yes is the thing I am most proud of in this entire story. Not because it was brave, though I suppose it required something. But because it was true, and I said it anyway, in the face of everything that had been telling me not to look too closely, not to make things difficult, not to be the neighbor who calls the police on a perfectly pleasant man who brings you zucchini from his garden. I said yes. And 3 women are not in that basement anymore. I think about them. I will think about them for the rest of my life, which feels right and also insufficient. I think about the one with the January coat and the flickering eyes, who is 24 years old and whose name I now know but will not say here because it is not mine to say. I think about what her life looks like now, a year and a half later. I hope it looks like something she chose. I hope she has warm enough coats. I think about Carol sometimes. I think about what it costs a person to know something and be too afraid to say it, and what it cost her specifically, and whether those costs are symmetrical with what her silence cost the people in her basement. I do not have an answer. I don't think I'm supposed to have a clean answer to that. I think about Robert. Less than you might expect. Not with the obsessive revisiting of his face or his manner or the Saturday afternoon with the boxes. Mostly I think about the 11 years of neighbors on that street who had been next to him and not known. About what careful looks like when someone has had years to perfect it. About how the quality in him that made people feel safe, that steady, unhurried, nothing to hide quality, was not a performance exactly but a construction. A thing he had built specifically to allow him to be what he was without being seen. The most dangerous thing is the thing that looks the most safe. I know that now. I knew it before in the abstract way that you know things that have not happened to you yet. I know it differently now. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who has a feeling they have been filing away. Not a dramatic feeling. Not proof of anything. Just a small, persistent, reasonable explanation-resistant thing that you have been living alongside and choosing not to name. I am not telling you that your neighbor is Robert Calloway. I am telling you that your intuition is information. I am telling you that the part of your brain that notices things before you consciously register them, that part is not producing noise. It is doing its job. And its job is to protect you and the people around you. I am telling you that making a call with inadequate evidence is embarrassing for about 15 minutes. Not making a call when you had adequate evidence is something you carry differently. I know the difference now. I wish I had learned it a different way. I am 32 years old and I live on the third floor of a building with good locks and neighbors I know by name and a window that faces the street and lets in the morning light and does not need to be covered. I moved in on a Saturday. Nobody helped me carry the boxes. I carried them myself one at a time, up 3 flights until they were all inside and the door was closed and the space was mine. And for the first time in longer than I can track, I felt completely, genuinely, unreservedly safe. That feeling is not a small thing. After everything, it is everything. And if you are watching this from inside a feeling you have been explaining away, if you have a window that is always covered, a sound you have not let yourself name, a look that flickered and disappeared before you could be sure you saw it, I want you to do one thing. Write it down. All of it. With dates. In order. And then look at what you have written. And trust what you see. Because the people who count on you not trusting what you see are counting on exactly that. Don't give it to them. And that is where Mara's story ends. Or maybe that is where it begins again. A 30-year-old woman who moved into a house to outrun grief and found herself instead. Found her own voice, her own clarity, her own willingness to say yes to a hard truth when a hard truth was what was needed. If this story reached you somewhere real, leave a comment. Tell me if you have ever had a feeling you talked yourself out of. Tell me if you would have made the call. Tell me what you would have done differently. I read every single comment. And if you are new here, welcome to Success Wisdom Stories. Subscribe. Because every week I bring you a story like this one. Where paying attention matters. Where one person's courage changes everything. And where the truth, however terrifying, is always better than the silence around it. I will see you in the next one.